Good afternoon and welcome to the Road to Recovery. I'm Karlo with ESPN Los Angeles, joined by Dr. Alan Beyer of the Hoag Orthopedic Institute. Dr. Beyer, going to need some of your expertise on this topic. Lonzo Ball, a very familiar name here in Los Angeles, of course, somebody who played and starred with the UCLA Bruins, eventually became a second overall draft pick by the Los Angeles Lakers, played well and now with the Chicago Bulls, but has been really rattled by injuries all his run with the Bulls. And he revealed today on his podcast, the WAE show, the What an Experience show, he said that for the first time, when he tore his meniscus in 2018, and fast forward to now, he feels positive that he'll come back and play because he received a rare meniscus transplant from a donor.
We know you got multiple procedures. Tell us what happened, where you are, and where you're going.
To make a long story short, ultimately, it started with a meniscus tear. Basically started on the Lakers when I tore it the first time. Tore it a couple more times to a point to where there was no more, basically not much meniscus left and bone on bone was rubbing. So the cartilage was gone and the bone was messed up. So I had to get actually a new meniscus from a donor. I had to get a bone allograft and I had to get some new cartilage put in as well. All that finally, healed up and now I'm back on the court now.
Have you ever heard of that before?
So yes, and it's not that rare. It's rare in professional sports. It's not exceedingly rare in the population that we take care of, over the years. It's becoming somewhat more commonplace and routine. I won't say routine. It's certainly more than routine. But the issue here is you have an athlete of his caliber. We've talked a lot about meniscal tears before with Mike Trout on one of our previous episodes, not too long ago. So the issues with meniscal tears in young athletes is, first off, we try to repair them whenever we can rather than remove meniscus, because the knee is better off with an entire meniscus to protect it than a part of a meniscus. And that requires a period of immobilization afterwards. Some menisci tear in what we call the white zone of the meniscus, where there's not a blood supply. So you have to actually just resect or remove the torn piece. If the tear is in the red zone of the meniscus, which has a blood supply, you can often repair it. We've gotten much, much better at this over the last 10 to 15 years and let it heal so the patient still has their whole meniscus. But what we're seeing here is the repetitive injury, first operation. I think the first operation actually was a meniscal repair in his case back in 2018. I'm not 100% certain on that, but I'm pretty sure they would have tried as hard as they could in somebody that young to repair his meniscus. He subsequently had another surgery after that to remove scar tissue, which sometimes happens after a meniscal repair, and clean the knee up in terms of the scar tissue and cartilage debris and stuff like that. I believe he had another operation after that, which was probably a partial meniscectomy, where the repair either failed or another area of the meniscus was torn and had to be resected, could not be repaired. And when you see an athlete at his caliber repetitively doing their sport, now he's doing it with a smaller meniscus than your God-given meniscus, the chances of that remaining portion of meniscus degenerating even further and becoming symptomatic and needing repair or usually resection, actually, by that point, becomes greater and greater. He had so many procedures on his knee and so many times that a piece of meniscus was removed, a piece of meniscus was removed, that he was left with basically almost no natural native meniscus. So what we do in those cases when a patient has lost just about their entire meniscus, either due to previous surgeries or an injury that's so catastrophic it tears up the meniscus, is we can do a meniscal transplant, which is basically taking the meniscus from a cadaver and it's implanted into the patient, attached in, sewn in, sometimes with a couple little bone blocks attached to it to aid with it being fixated solidly so it doesn't come off from its attachment points. It's a procedure that takes a significant amount of time to heal from. It's not done purely arthroscopically. There are small incisions involved, and you have to let the meniscus tissue heal into the person's native tissue. Sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't take, for want of a better word, and the patient kind of rejects it, almost like you reject a heart transplant, or has a lot of inflammation around it. So the knee remains very inflamed, even though you've done a successful surgery from a procedural standpoint. But once it's healed in and socked in, one would hope that people could rehabilitate enough to get back to their activities of daily living. Unfortunately, if your activity of daily living is playing professional basketball, that might be asking too much of a meniscus that's transplanted, because you do your best bet to match the patient's size and body habitus and shape of their knee to the transplanted allograft meniscus, which, as I said, is coming from a cadaver. It's not always going to be a perfect match. There might be a few millimeters difference one way or the other. So already you've started out with a meniscus that's not exactly the same size and shape as your God-given meniscus, which you've lost over time. So that's where we're at now. He's in the healing phase of having had a meniscal transplant from a cadaver, an allograft transplant. And the hope is that he can heal it enough and rehabilitate enough, because, the Beyer rule of thumb is always for every week that you shut down using your muscles, it takes 3 weeks to get them back. So if you're shut down for, 4 months, that's a year till you really get your muscle tone back to where it was before you were immobilized. So that's where I think we're at now. He's in that healing phase, and I love his optimism. It's Kobe-esque almost, for want of a better word. Like a second Tommy John surgery, this one is one of those ones that we don't have a lot of data on meniscal transplants being done on professional athletes. It's just not something that's come up a lot. It's usually a career ender when an athlete has the degree of meniscal degeneration that he had previously had.
That's such a sobering response, Doc, especially coming from.
I am sober. I will tell you, I am sober right now.
But for Lonzo to post a video of him dunking a few weeks ago and just being excited to play basketball, and you talk about the rehab process and taking your time. The Bulls actually was thinking about having him play at some point this season, but they extended him to make sure that he doesn't really restart basketball activities until June. So in a good way, for him to just really take his time and not so much any pressure on that. And Doc, hearing him say that his knee was bone to bone already, and he's 26 years old, Doc, and you were talking about that 2018 initial surgery. He was 20 years old when he was starting to go under the knife to repair this knee. I'd like to be optimistic as Lonzo is, but hearing you talk about, hey, there's no way you're going to find a cadaver that has the sustainability of an NBA player, especially a point guard who's always going to be stopping on the dime and has a history of injuries already. But what would be those first signs that you would want to see to feel good about Lonzo's future in the NBA?
Well, let's unpack a little bit of some of the things that you just said. Number one, he's being a little bit dramatic when he says I was bone on bone. By definition, when you take out the entire meniscus, that bumper between your two bones, the femur and the tibia, is gone. So theoretically, you're bone on bone. You don't have that bumper in between them anymore, but you do have articular cartilage that lines both bones. So you're cartilage on cartilage rather than bone on bone. Though I will hazard a guess, never having seen him as a patient or seen his MRI scan, that articular cartilage that he still has is not, virginal, perfect, undamaged articular cartilage. I'm sure he has some damage to articular cartilage as well, just from wear and tear and previous surgeries. But let's also draw some comparisons here. When Magic Johnson was in the NBA, only a little over a year, he tore his meniscus. And in those days, that was back in the late 70s, I think. I think it was 1979, if I remember correctly. In those days, we didn't have the capability to repair menisci the way we do now. We didn't even take menisci out arthroscopically back in 1979 all the time. That arthroscopic surgery was just coming into its own. Magic Johnson had his entire medial meniscus removed through a small open incision. and went on to do pretty well after that, but playing without a meniscus in between his two bones, and had a pretty stellar career for an awful long time after that. So a lot of
That's why
people,
he wore that large purple brace around his
yes, that's one of the reasons he
left
did.
knee.
But there's also other factors here. Is there any damage to the ACL, to the intercruciate ligament? Is it a pristine ACL? Is there a partial ACL tear that comes over years of banging on your knee and being a point guard and stops and starts and things like that, where there's a little bit of laxity in that knee and it moves a little bit asynchronously from what it should if the ACL was entirely intact? These are all factors that go into, will he be able to come back or won't he be able to come back? So I first of all, I applaud them for saying it's going to be next season. I think that's give him all the time he needs to rehabilitate. And this is the same mentality of giving a Tommy John 18 months to heal after an elbow is reconstructed. Don't rush him back too soon. So I think that caution is warranted. I hope he's not being over optimistic. I don't know the answer. And again, this is lack of data on our part. We just don't have a ton of meniscal allografts that are functioning in high caliber professional athletes. So he's going to be a little bit of a trailblazer here.
Now, I want to cross my fingers and hope that Lonzo is right, because he feels that he is set and ready, on target to play the opening night of the upcoming 2024-25 season. I just hope
That's what we're all
right.
hoping for. And, orthopedic surgery's come a long way in the 43 years that I've been doing it. And this is one of those ways. And I just hope we're heading down the right track.
Doc, thanks for helping me take a look at Lonzo Ball's knee. And Doc, let's take a look ahead. What's coming up on Doc in the Dugout?
Well, the next couple of weeks, we're going to be bringing in some people who participate and care for Olympic athletes. We've only got 2 months to go till the Paris Olympics. I think it's time for all of us to start getting psyched and ready for that. It's always a big thing every 4 years. A lot of sports that we don't think about, like swimming and other things, seem to only be on a 4-year cycle. We're only excited about them when the Olympics comes. We forget about them the other 3 years. These athletes who do these sports are training for it all 4 years. It's their world for that whole time. And I think we've got to take our hats off to them and really appreciate these athletes who devote themselves to some of these sports that don't get the exposure in the press that, the big four get.
Yeah, I'd love to take a detour on the road to recovery and take a look at some of these lesser known sports, Dr. B. And on that note, bon voyage, Doc, and have a great rest of the weekend.
Thank you. Happy Memorial Day weekend to everybody out there. And be sure to listen to Doctor in the Dugout on AM 830 Angels Radio every Saturday, 12 noon.